The great hall of the Galactic Concordance stretched so high that clouds formed near its ceiling. Ambassador Sarah Chen stood at the center of the speaking circle, trying not to feel small. Around her, arranged in a rising spiral, sat representatives from 12 alien species. Each one looked down at her, both literally and figuratively. Sarah had spent 3 years preparing for this moment. She wore her best diplomatic uniform, and her team stood behind her with data tablets and presentation materials. This was humanity's chance to join the galactic community as full members, not just curious newcomers who had stumbled into space 50 years ago. The Valier ambassador spoke first. His name was Thelvan, and he looked like a cross between a crane and a crystal sculpture. His species had ruled the council for thousands of years. And everyone knew it. So, Thelvan said, his voice like wind chimes made of ice. The humans wish to join us. How quaint. Sarah kept her smile professional. Yes, Ambassador. We believe Earth has much to offer the Concordance. Our scientists, our artists, your scientists, interrupted a Kesh delegate, her tentacles rippling with what might have been laughter. You've barely left your own star system. We were building quantum bridges when your species was still living in caves. Several other delegates made sounds of agreement. Sarah felt her teammate Marcus Webb shift uncomfortably behind her. Lieutenant Yuki Tanaka, their military escort, remained perfectly still. We may be young, Sarah said carefully, but we learn quickly. Our linguistic databases alone contain over 7,000 languages, and we've been studying your cultures intensively. 7,000. Thelvan's crest flared in amusement. Child's babbling. The Valier have maintained one perfect language for 40,000 years. One language unchanged, passed down through genetic memory from parent to child. Can you imagine such purity? Such dedication? Sarah couldn't help herself. But doesn't that limit? Thelvan stood, his height suddenly imposing. You speak of limits? You whose oldest records barely span 5 millennia. You who must write everything down because you cannot even remember your own history properly. You who fragment into thousands of tongues because you lack the genetic capacity for true linguistic unity? The chamber fell silent. Sarah felt heat rising to her cheeks. Around the spiral, other delegates were making their species equivalent of nods. Even the few who had seemed neutral were now looking at her with something like pity. The Concordance, Thelvan continued, warming to his theme, is an organization of ancient peoples. Species who have maintained their cultures, their languages, their identities across tens of thousands of years. You humans are linguistic infants, cultural children playing dress-up in the Adults' Council. Marcus stepped forward, but Sarah held up a hand to stop him. If we could just show you our cultural archives. We have seen enough, said a Zorathi delegate, her fur patterns shifting to show dismissal. Perhaps in another 1,000 years, when you've proven you can maintain a stable civilization, we can revisit this discussion. But, Sarah tried. The council votes now, Thelvan announced. All in favor of granting humanity full membership? Not a single hand, tentacle, or appendage rose, motion denied. This session is concluded. The delegates began to rise. Sarah stood frozen in the speaking circle, her carefully prepared presentations unused, her 3 years of work dismissed in 15 minutes. As the Valier delegation passed by, Thelvan spoke to his aide in High Valier, clearly believing no human present could understand the ancient dialect. Sarah had studied 17 Valier language variations, but High Valier remained mostly a mystery to human scholars. Keshtar Vena, Kathanishmare, Thelvan said with clear contempt. His aide responded with a trilling laugh, and they swept from the chamber. Sarah's team gathered around her as the hall emptied. Marcus looked furious. Yuki's hand rested near her sidearm, though there was no physical threat to fight. Did you catch what he said at the end? Marcus asked. Sarah shook her head. Not exactly. Something dismissive, obviously. I caught part of it, said Dr. Kenji Sato, their xenolinguistics specialist. Roughly translates to dust pretending to be mountains or maybe sand thinking itself stone. Hard to be precise with High Valier. Pompous bastards, Marcus muttered. Marcus, Sarah warned. Though her heart wasn't in it, she felt the same way. They walked through the empty halls toward the human embassy quarters. Earth's flags looked small and out of place among the ancient banners of species that had sailed between stars before humanity had invented the wheel. 3 years? Sarah said quietly. 3 years of preparation? Cultural exchange programs, trade negotiations. All of it for nothing. Not nothing, Yuki said. Now we know where we stand. At the bottom, Marcus said bitterly. Always at the bottom, always the newcomers, always the children. They reached their quarters and collapsed into chairs. Sarah's assistant brought tea, a small comfort from home. They sat in silence, sipping earth-grown tea on a station that orbited a star whose light had never touched their homeworld. We have 6 months, Sarah finally said. They'll make their final decision then, whether to restrict our contact further or allow us to remain as provisional members. We need a new approach. They won't listen, Marcus said. You heard them. We're too young, too divided, too human. Then we need to show them something they can't dismiss. Sarah set down her cup with sudden determination, something none of their ancient, perfect civilizations can do. Marcus looked at her with interest. What did you have in mind? Sarah smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. I don't know yet, but I'm tired of being mocked for being human. Maybe it's time we showed them what being human actually means. Outside the window, stars wheeled in their ancient dance, indifferent to the pride of empires old and new. The human embassy on Station Concordance was quiet that evening. Most of the staff had gone to bed, but Sarah's team remained in the conference room, surrounded by tablets displaying the day's humiliation in data form. Every declined proposal, every dismissive comment, every vote of zero support. Marcus Webb sat apart from the others, staring at his personal tablet with unusual intensity. Sarah had known him for 8 years since they'd worked together on the Proxima translation project. She recognized that look. He was working up the courage to say something. Marcus, she said, breaking the tired silence. You've been quiet. That's not like you. He looked up and Sarah saw something in his eyes she hadn't expected. Excitement. I need to show you something, he said. Something I've been working on for 15 years. Something I wasn't supposed to share with anyone. Yuki straightened in her chair. Classified? No, nothing like that, just academically embarrassing. Marcus stood and connected his tablet to the room's main display. Everyone in xenolinguistics knows about the ghost script. It's practically a joke in the field. Sarah frowned. The ancient symbols found on dead worlds? Those random markings in the outer veil? They're not random, Marcus said quietly. That's what everyone thinks, but they're not. The display filled with images of strange symbols carved into stone, etched into metal, painted on walls. They looked chaotic, inconsistent, impossible to read. Sarah had seen them in her studies. Every xenolinguist had. They appeared on dozens of dead worlds scattered across the galaxy, worlds where no life had existed for thousands of years. Marcus, Kenji said gently, we've all looked at those. The Galactic Council studied them for centuries. There's no pattern. It's just archaeological noise, interesting but meaningless. That's what I thought too, Marcus said. 15 years ago, I was on an expedition to Kesh 4. You remember, Sarah? The mission where we found those crystallized libraries? Sarah nodded. She'd stayed on the ship that trip, working on translation protocols. Marcus had been gone for 3 months on the planet's surface. I spent weeks in those ruins, Marcus continued, and something bothered me. The symbols weren't random. They repeated in specific patterns, but not like any language I knew. Then one night, I was reviewing my notes on extinct Earth languages, just hobby reading, and I saw something. He pulled up 2 images side by side. On the left, a section of ghost script from Kesh 4. On the right, ancient Sumerian cuneiform from Earth. They're not identical, Marcus said quickly before anyone could object. But look at the structural patterns. The way compound symbols are formed. The grammatical flow markers. It's not that aliens visited Earth. It's that both represent similar solutions to similar linguistic problems. Sarah leaned forward, studying the comparison. She'd learned Sumerian as part of her doctoral work. Marcus wasn't wrong. The similarity was subtle but present. So you think the ghost script is actually a language? She asked. Not just a language? Marcus's hands moved excitedly as he spoke. I think it's a meta-language. A framework designed to teach and preserve other languages. And I think I can read parts of it. The room fell silent. Yuki set down her coffee cup carefully. Kenji's mouth had fallen open. Marcus, Sarah said carefully, if you could read even a sentence of ghost script, you'd be famous. Every major university in the galaxy has tried and failed for 2,000 years. I know. That's why I didn't tell anyone. I thought I was seeing patterns that weren't there. making connections from desperation. But after today, after hearing Thelvan mock us for being linguistic infants, Marcus's jaw tightened. I think our weakness is actually our strength. Explain, Sarah said. Marcus pulled up more displays. Charts showing linguistic evolution, genetic memory patterns in alien species' human learning capacity. Every species in the concordance has genetic memory for language, he said. The Valar are the most extreme example. They're born knowing High Valar. It's in their DNA. Same with most other species to varying degrees. It makes them stable, traditional, excellent at preserving their own languages. But, Sarah prompted, but it also makes them inflexible. They can't think outside their linguistic framework. When they look at Ghostscript, their genetic memory tells them it's wrong, impossible, not language. They can't process it because it doesn't match anything in their inherited knowledge. Kenji caught on first. But humans don't have genetic memory for language. We're born linguistic blank slates. Exactly! Marcus was pacing now. We have to learn everything from scratch, which they see as a weakness. But it also means we can learn anything. We don't have inherited prejudices about what language should look like. We've proven that. We've learned alien languages that no other species can speak because our mouths and brains are flexible enough. Sarah felt her pulse quickening. You think we can decode the ghost script because we're not constrained by genetic memory? I think we're the only species in the galaxy who can, Marcus said. And I think that's exactly what the ghost script was designed for. Who designed it? Yuki asked. Marcus pulled up an image of a star chart, ancient and worn. Whoever left it wanted it to be found by someone eventually. Someone flexible enough to learn it. The Galactic Council calls the civilization that created it the predecessors. They disappeared 80,000 years ago. No one knows why. And you think humans can read their language? Sarah asked. I think we can learn to. I've already made progress. Basic words, grammatical structures. But I need help. Real linguistic support. Access to more sites, resources the embassy can't provide. Sarah looked at her team. Kenji was studying the symbols with new interest. Yuki looked skeptical but intrigued. If you're right, Sarah said slowly. If we could actually read the ghost script when no other species can, that would change everything. We wouldn't be the young, ignorant humans anymore. We'd be offering something unique, something valuable, Kenji added. Something they need. Marcus finished. Sarah stood and walked to the window. Outside, the galaxy turned ancient and vast. Somewhere out there were dead worlds covered in symbols that no living being could read, symbols that might contain knowledge lost for 80,000 years. How long would it take? She asked. We have 6 months until the final decision. I don't know, Marcus admitted. But if we can show even a basic translation, prove the concept, it might be enough, Sarah made her decision. Yuki, file a request for transportation to Kesh 4. Diplomatic research mission. Kenji, pull everything we have on the ghost script sites. Marcus, start preparing your research for peer review. You believe me? Marcus asked quietly. Sarah smiled. You're my friend and you're brilliant, and today I watched pompous aliens mock humanity for learning too much, too fast, in too many ways. If they think our lack of genetic memory makes us inferior, then let's prove them wrong. Let's show them what human adaptability can really do. Marcus grinned, and for the first time since the council meeting, Sarah felt hope. Let's go wake the dead, she said. Kesh 4 was a dead world. Its sun burned cold and blue, and nothing lived on the surface except dust and memory. The human shuttle landed near the largest ruins, structures that rose from the orange sand like the bones of giants. Sarah stepped out first, her boots crunching on ground that hadn't felt footsteps in thousands of years. The ruins stretched for kilometers in every direction, perfect geometric patterns worn smooth by time and wind. It's beautiful, Kenji whispered through his helmet comm. It's sad, Yuki corrected. A whole civilization gone. Marcus was already moving toward the nearest structure, scanning equipment in hand. Not gone, just sleeping. Come on. They spent the first week mapping the site. It was larger than anyone had realized. The structures connected by underground passages that still held air. Somehow, after all these centuries, the walls were covered in ghost script, layer upon layer of symbols. It's not a city, Sarah realized on the 8th day. They were standing in a massive chamber, its walls disappearing into darkness above them. Marcus, this whole planet isn't a settlement. It's a library. Marcus had stopped breathing for a moment. He slowly turned, scanning the walls with his equipment and his eyes. You're right. It's all storage, knowledge storage. Every building, every structure, they're all archives. Archives of what? Yuki asked. Everything, Marcus said in wonder. Look at the organizational patterns. Each sector represents a different subject. This area here. He pointed to a section where the symbols were particularly dense. I think this is linguistic archives. Languages. Hundreds of them. Maybe thousands. For the next month, they worked 16-hour days. Marcus had been right about the structural patterns. Once Sarah understood the basic framework, she could identify word boundaries, grammatical markers, mathematical notations. It was like learning to read music after a lifetime of only hearing songs. Kenji made the first real breakthrough on day 37. He'd been studying a wall that seemed to contain introductory material, symbols repeated in clear teaching patterns. I've got a word, he said, his voice shaking. An actual word. It means to preserve or to keep safe. Look, here's how it's constructed. Root symbol for time, modifier for protection, connector for intentional action. Sarah rushed over. He was right. She could see it now, how the symbols built meaning through combination. It was elegant, logical, and completely unlike any language system the Galactic Council used. If we have one word, Sarah said, we can find more. Words in context. This is how we teach children to read. Pattern recognition, repetition, context clues. They worked with renewed energy. One word became 10. 10 became 50. The ghost script began to reveal itself slowly, grudgingly, like ice melting in spring. On day 60, Sarah read her first complete sentence. She stood alone in a small chamber, her translation tablet in hand, staring at a simple line of symbols above a doorway. Here rests the knowledge of those who came before, so that those who come after might remember. She felt tears on her cheeks and didn't brush them away. By day 90, they could read basic texts fluently. Marcus had been right about the meta-language concept. The ghost script wasn't just one language. It was a teaching framework that contained instructions for learning and preserving hundreds of different languages. They knew, Marcus said one evening as they reviewed the day's findings, the predecessors knew their civilization was dying. So they built this, a library designed to teach anyone who found it, no matter what language they spoke, no matter how different their minds were. But why couldn't the other species read it? Kenji asked. Surely some aliens tried over the centuries. They tried, Sarah said, understanding now, but their genetic memory worked against them. When a Velar looks at this, she gestured at the walls, their brain keeps trying to map it to high Velar structures. It's like trying to hear a new song when someone's shouting old lyrics in your ears. They can't not hear their inherited language. But we can, Marcus said, because we inherit nothing. Every human infant is a blank page. We have to learn language from the environment, which means we're perfectly adapted to learn environmental languages. Languages designed to be learned rather than inherited. Sarah pulled up her most important discovery. I found something today in the Central Archive. The predecessors, they called themselves the first teachers. They didn't conquer worlds or build empires. They traveled the galaxy, teaching younger species, sharing knowledge, preserving languages and cultures. What happened to them? Yuki asked. A plague? Sarah said quietly, reading from her translation. Something that spread through their genetic memory. The same mechanism they used to pass down knowledge. It killed them in a single generation. But before they died, they built places like this. Museums, schools, libraries, all designed to be read by anyone who developed language, as long as they were flexible enough to learn it. Marcus pulled up another text, one that made his hands shake. Sarah, look at this. It was a linguistic genealogy chart showing the evolution of languages across thousands of years. At the top, the first teacher's original tongue. Below it, branching lines showing derivative languages, each one adapted for different species, different worlds. Do you see it? Marcus asked. Sarah saw it. One branch evolved over thousands of years, simplified and modified. High Velar. Another branch, Kesh diplomatic language. Another, Zorathi formal speech. The modern concordance languages, Kenji breathed. They're all descended from the ghost script, from the first teachers. They're not pure and ancient, Sarah said, understanding flooding through her. They're evolutionary descendants, corrupted copies passed down and simplified over millennia, until the species using them forgot where they came from. The genetic memory preserved the sounds, Marcus explained, but not the meaning. It's like that game where you whisper a message down a line of people. By the end, it's completely different, but everyone's certain they're repeating it exactly right because they heard it from the person before them. Sarah sat down heavily. Thelvan mocked us for having no genetic memory, for being linguistic infants, but we're the only ones who can read the language his own species descended from. We're the only ones who can speak to his ancestors. What do we do? Yuki asked practically. Sarah looked at her team. They'd been on HFY for 3 months. They were tired, dusty, and running low on supplies. But they'd done the impossible. They'd spoken with the dead and heard them answer. We go back, Sarah said. We request another council session. And we teach the galaxy a lesson they've forgotten. They won't believe us, Kenji warned. Then we'll prove it, Sarah said, standing. We'll walk into the Veiler's own sacred archives and read the words their own scholars can't decipher. We'll show them their own history spoken in their ancestors' true voice. Marcus smiled. You want to see Thelvan's face when a human reads his precious ancient texts better than he can? I want to show him, Sarah corrected, that being young doesn't mean being ignorant. That learning is better than remembering. That humanity's greatest strength is that we're not chained to the past, we're free to rediscover it. Outside, the dead sun set over the ruins of the first teachers, and in the ancient halls, human voices spoke words that hadn't been heard in 80,000 years. The ghosts, if they existed, were finally being heard. The Galactic Concordance Hall looked exactly the same as it had 4 months earlier. Sarah stood in the same speaking circle, wearing the same diplomatic uniform, but everything else had changed. This time she didn't feel small. The council members filtered in slowly, clearly annoyed at being called for an emergency session. Thelvan arrived last, his crystalline features arranged in an expression of maximum disdain. Ambassador Chen, he said, not bothering to sit. Your request for an emergency session was most irregular. The final vote on your membership status isn't scheduled for another 2 months. What could possibly be so urgent? Sarah smiled. We've made a discovery, Ambassador. One that concerns the entire concordance. With your permission, I'd like to present our findings. More cultural databases? The Kesh delegate asked, tentacles curling with boredom. More promises of future contributions? No, Sarah said simply. A discovery about your past. That got their attention. Thelvan sat down slowly, gesturing for her to continue. Sarah nodded to Marcus, who activated the display. Images of HFY filled the screens. Ruins stark against orange sand. Over the past 4 months, Sarah began, our team has been conducting linguistic research on HFY. You all know of this site. It contains examples of what the Concordance calls the Ghost Script, ancient symbols found on dead worlds throughout the Outer Veil. Yes, Thelvan interrupted. Academic curiosities, interesting artifacts but ultimately meaningless. No living being can read them. This has been established for 2,000 years. Actually, Sarah said quietly, we can read them. The chamber erupted in noise. Delegates spoke over each other in a dozen languages. Thelvan's crest flared in what Sarah now recognized as anger, not just amusement. Impossible, he said flatly. You're claiming that humanity in 4 months accomplished what the greatest minds in the galaxy couldn't do in 2 millennia? Yes, Sarah said. Prove it, demanded the Zarathi delegate. Sarah had been hoping for this. She pulled up an image of a simple ghost script text, one that Marcus had found in the outer archives of HFY. The symbols glowed on the screen, complex and beautiful. This text, Sarah said, and then she began to read aloud in ghost script. The sounds were strange in her mouth, consonants that clicked and vowels that hummed, but she'd practiced for weeks. Shaketh vanarim kethar ventalum, vesha kethar vanar shaketh. She switched to English. To preserve knowledge is to preserve life. To preserve life, we preserve knowledge. The silence that followed was absolute. You. Thelvan stood slowly. You spoke it. You actually spoke the ghost script. Yes, Sarah said, and translated it. Should I continue? She pulled up another text, this one more complex. A philosophical treatise about the nature of memory and learning. She read it fluently, translating as she went, explaining the grammatical structures that made the ghost script work. Kenji stepped forward with technical displays, showing how they decoded the language patterns. Marcus presented their findings on the meta-language framework. how the ghost script was designed to teach rather than simply communicate. Through it all, the council sat in stunned silence. Finally, Sarah reached her most important revelation. She pulled up the linguistic genealogy chart they'd found in the Central Archive. The civilization that built these archives called themselves the First Teachers, she said. They existed 80,000 years ago, and they traveled the galaxy sharing knowledge. When they died out, they left behind these libraries designed to be readable by anyone flexible enough to learn them. She highlighted a branch of the chart. This is High Valir Ambassador Thelvan. Your language, which you've told me is pure and unchanged for 40,000 years. Thelvan leaned forward, studying the chart. According to the First Teacher's own records, Sarah continued gently, High Valir is a descendant language. It evolved from a teaching dialect the First Teachers created specifically for your ancestors. Over thousands of years it was simplified, modified, passed down through genetic memory. You've preserved it beautifully, but it's not original. It's a gift from a civilization that died long before yours began. The implications crashed through the chamber like a wave. Thelvan's crest had gone completely still, a sign of shock in his species. You're saying the Valir language is derived? That we're not? He couldn't finish the sentence. You're not the source, Sarah said. None of you are. Every major language in the concordance traces back to the First Teachers. The Kesh diplomatic tongue, the Zorathi formal speech, even the mathematical languages the Kelnari use, all descended from teaching frameworks designed to help young species communicate. The Kesh delegates' tentacles had turned pale. How can you be certain? Because we can read the source documents, Marcus said, stepping forward. Your genetic memories preserve the sounds and structures, but not the meaning or the context. You've been speaking corrupted versions of these languages for so long that you think they're pure. But humans don't have genetic memory. We had to learn the ghost script from scratch, which means we learned it correctly. This is absurd, Thelvan said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. You're telling me that humans, whom I called linguistic infants, can read my ancestors' language better than I can? Yes, Sarah said simply. Your genetic memory is your strength in preserving what you know. But it's also your limitation. You can't learn what contradicts your inherited knowledge. We can, because we start from nothing every generation. She pulled up another text, one that made her heart ache. This is from the Central Archive on Karish 4. It's a message from the First Teachers, written as they were dying. She read it aloud, first in ghost script, then translated. We leave this knowledge for those who come after. We hope you will preserve what we could not, the wisdom to teach, the humility to learn, and the flexibility to change. Do not make our mistake. Do not let pride chain you to the past. The future belongs to those who can learn from history without being imprisoned by it. The chamber was completely silent. Sarah saw several delegates with their heads bowed. Even Thelvan seemed stunned. They knew, Sarah said softly. The First Teachers knew that genetic memory, the very thing that let them pass knowledge so efficiently, was also the plague that killed them. It made them rigid, unable to adapt when their environment changed. They built these archives hoping that someone eventually would be flexible enough to learn from them. She looked directly at Thelvan. You mocked us for having no genetic memory, for needing to write everything down, for fracturing into thousands of languages. But those traits are exactly what allowed us to hear your ancestors speaking. We're not linguistic infants, Ambassador. We're the students your ancestors hoped would come. Thelvan sat down slowly. His crest had begun to tremble, a sign of deep emotional disturbance in his species. He began, then stopped. I need to see this. The archives. The original text. Of course, Sarah said. We've prepared a full expedition proposal. The First Teachers left hundreds of sites across the galaxy. We've only explored one. There's so much more to learn. And you can teach us? Asked the Zorathi delegate quietly. To read as you do? We can try, Sarah said. It won't be easy. You'll have to learn to ignore your genetic memories to think in new patterns. But if you're willing to learn, we're willing to teach. The council chamber felt different now. The ancient grandeur seemed less imposing, more like a museum, beautiful but belonging to the past. We need time, Thelvan said finally. To process this. To verify your claims. Of course, Sarah agreed. We have full documentation, genetic samples from the archives, everything you need. Take all the time you need. As the session adjourned, Thelvan approached Sarah in the speaking circle. Up close, she could see the trembling in his crystalline structure. The sign of a worldview cracking apart. You've undone 40,000 years of certainty, he said quietly. No, Sarah corrected gently. We've given you 80,000 years of history. That's not nothing. Thelvan studied her for a long moment. Your species learns quickly, Ambassador Chen. Perhaps too quickly for comfort. Or perhaps, Sarah said, at exactly the speed the galaxy needs. The Valier homeworld of Thelvar was beautiful in a way that made Sarah's chest ache. Crystal spires grew from living stone, refracting light into rainbows that painted the streets. Everything was precise, ordered, perfect. 40,000 years of continuous civilization had smoothed away any roughness, any chaos. It felt like a museum come to life. Thelvan met them at the landing platform, his crest arranged in the formal pattern of reluctant hospitality. Behind him stood 24 Valier scholars, their crystalline features showing various degrees of skepticism and offense. Ambassador Chen, Thelvan said stiffly, the Council has agreed to your demonstration. However, I must warn you that the Archive of First Words is our most sacred site. If you're wrong, if this is some elaborate deception, the consequences will be severe. We understand, Sarah said. She'd brought only Marcus and Kenji for this trip. Yuki had wanted to come as protection, but Sarah had refused. This needed to be about scholarship, not strength. They traveled through the city in silence. Valier citizens stopped to stare at the humans, their expressions unreadable. Sarah wondered what they'd been told, what rumors had spread since the council session. The Archive of First Words sat at the city's heart, a structure older than any other. It was carved from a single massive crystal, naturally formed and shaped over millennia by Valier master craftsmen. Light moved through it like music made visible. Inside, the temperature dropped noticeably. The walls were covered in ancient Valier script, layer upon layer of text that glowed with internal luminescence. These are the oldest words of our people, Thelvan said, his voice filled with reverence. The first texts passed down through genetic memory for 40,000 years. Every Valier child knows these passages. They're part of us, literally coded into our DNA. But you can't fully translate them, Marcus said carefully. We understand them. One of the Valier scholars snapped. They speak of creation, of the first word spoken, of the purity of our linguistic heritage. May I? Sarah asked, approaching the nearest wall. Thelvan gestured permission, though his crest had arranged itself in defensive patterns. Sarah studied the text carefully. It was High Valier, yes, but ancient, the root form from which the modern language descended. She could see the ghost script patterns underneath it like bones beneath skin. This first section, she said, tracing the symbols without touching them. You translated as in the beginning was the word, and the word was pure, correct? Yes, Thelvan confirmed. It's the foundation of our linguistic philosophy, the pure word unchanged and perfect. That's not quite right, Sarah said gently. She pulled out her tablet, showing the ghost script linguistic patterns. The symbols you read as pure actually mean gifted or taught. And this character that you interpret as beginning, in the original ghost script framework, it means after the silence or after the forgetting. The Valier scholars pressed closer, studying her tablet with intense focus. The actual translation, Sarah continued, would be something like, after the forgetting came the gifted word, and the word was taught. This isn't about linguistic purity. It's about linguistic inheritance. Someone gave you this language. That's impossible, a scholar said, but he sounded uncertain. We've studied these texts for millennia. Every generation of scholars has verified the translations. You've verified them against your genetic memory, Marcus explained. But genetic memory is like a game of telephone played across thousands of generations. The sounds stay mostly the same, but the meaning shifts, simplifies, changes to match what makes sense to each new generation. Kenji pulled up a comparative analysis on his tablet. Look at this passage here. In modern High Valier, you read this as we speak with one voice forever. But the ancient root symbols actually say we speak with the voice of the one who came before. It's not about unity. It's about inheritance. Sarah moved to another section of the wall, one that the Valier considered particularly sacred. This entire wall, you call it the hymn of linguistic genesis. Your scholars say it describes how your ancestors created the first language from thought itself. Yes, Thelvan said quietly. It's the most important text in our culture. Sarah took a deep breath. This would hurt, she knew, but truth often did. It's not a creation hymn, she said. It's a survival manual, She began to read, translating the ancient symbols using her knowledge of ghost script patterns. As she spoke, she saw the Valir scholars' crests beginning to droop. We arrived on the 4th planet after the Great Forgetting. The ship was damaged. The memory carriers were dying. Only the teaching songs remained, passed down through genetics. We carved these words so that our children's children might remember. You were not born here. You were saved here. The first teachers gave you words when yours were lost. Honor them by learning, not by claiming you need no teachers. The silence in the archive was profound. One of the Valir scholars made a sound like breaking glass, the sound of their species crying. This can't be right, Thelvan said, but his voice was hollow. Our entire history, our identity, we're the elder race. The pure language unchanged for 40 millennia. You are an elder race, Sarah said firmly. You've maintained a continuous civilization for 40,000 years. That's extraordinary, but you're not the source. You're the survivors. And these texts, she gestured at the walls, they're not boasting about purity. They're thanking the first teachers for saving your ancestors when they'd lost everything. Marcus approached a different section. Look here. This part that you translate as, we reject the corruption of foreign tongues. The actual text says, we remember the gift of the teaching tongue. Your ancestors weren't rejecting outside influence. They were grateful for it. Another Valir scholar approached the wall trembling. She began to sound out the ancient symbols using Sarah's framework, and her eyes went wide. The ceremony of purity, she whispered. The ritual we perform every generation to cleanse our language of foreign corruption. The original text calls it the ceremony of remembrance. We're supposed to be remembering the first teachers, not purifying ourselves of their influence. The revelations cascaded through the archive as the Valir scholars began rereading their own sacred texts with new understanding. Everything they'd thought was about purity was actually about gratitude. Everything they'd interpreted as origin was actually about refuge. Thelvan stood motionless in the center of the archive, his crest completely flat against his skull, a sign of shock so profound it bordered on trauma. We've been wrong, he said finally. For 40,000 years we've been wrong. Not wrong, Sarah said gently. Incomplete. You preserved the words beautifully, but you lost the context, and context is what gives words meaning. My ancestors, Thelvan continued as if Sarah hadn't spoken, were refugees, not creators, not originals. Refugees who were given a gift and then, over thousands of years, convinced themselves they'd made it themselves. Yes, Sarah said. But that doesn't make your civilization less valuable. You took what you were given and built something magnificent. 40,000 years of continuous culture, that's not nothing. One of the younger scholars spoke up, her voice shaking. The first teachers. The ones who gave us this gift. They're the ones who created the ghost script? Yes, Marcus confirmed, and they're all dead? Yes, but humans can read their language. The scholar looked at Sarah with something approaching awe. You can speak to our ancestors, teachers. You can hear voices we thought were lost forever. Sarah nodded slowly, understanding what this meant to them. We can, and we'd like to share that knowledge with you. To teach you to read as we do if you're willing to learn. Learn from humans? Another scholar said, and Sarah braced for mockery. But instead, the Valir continued. From the species who can speak to the first teachers. Yes, I would learn that. I would learn anything to hear those voices clearly. Thelvan finally moved, approaching Sarah directly. He was taller than her and older, and his species had ruled the concordance for generations. But when he spoke, his voice was humble. I mocked you, he said. I called you linguistic infants. I said you were dust pretending to be mountains. I remember, Sarah said quietly. I was wrong. You're not pretending to be anything. You're exactly what the galaxy needs. Someone who can learn without the burden of genetic pride. Someone who can hear the past without being chained to it. His crest rippled with what might have been laughter or might have been sorrow. The joke, it seems, was on me. The joke was on all of us, Sarah said. Every species in the concordance so proud of their ancient languages, never realizing they'd lost the ability to truly understand them. Humanity's curse, starting over every generation, turned out to be exactly what was needed to break through. She looked around at the archive, at the glowing walls filled with words that had been misread for 40,000 years. Your ancestors left you a message, Ambassador. About humility, about learning, about gratitude. It took humans to read it, but it was always your message. We're just the translators. Thelvan touched the wall gently, his fingers tracing symbols that now meant something completely different than he'd believed his entire life. Then translate more, he said. Please. Teach us to hear our ancestors as they truly spoke. Show us what else we've forgotten. And in the Crystal Archive on an alien world, humans began to teach their teachers how tone year later. Sarah stood in the Concordance Hall again. The chamber looked the same as always, ancient and imposing, but she noticed things now that she'd missed before. Ghost script patterns hidden in the oldest decorative elements. Linguistic markers from the first teachers embedded in architecture so old that no living species remembered who'd built it. The galaxy was full of ghosts. Humanity had just learned to see them. The vote was unanimous. 12 hands, tentacles, and appendages rose in approval of humanity's full membership. But that wasn't the important part. The important part came after. Ambassador Chen, Thelvan said, standing at his delegation seat. His crest was arranged in the pattern of formal respect. On behalf of the Concordance, we offer humanity a position beyond simple membership. We propose that Earth become the home of the Institute of Dead Languages, and that humans serve as keepers of the predecessor archives. The title had weight to it. Keeper. Not explorer, not researcher. Keeper. Guardian of memory. We accept, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the emotion swirling in her chest. With honor. The ceremony continued, formal and proper, but Sarah's mind was already elsewhere. On Kesh 4, where 3 permanent research stations now operated. On Thelvar, where Valir scholars were learning to read their own history. On a dozen other worlds where ghost script sites had been found, each one containing knowledge the galaxy had forgotten. After the ceremony, she returned to the Institute. It occupied an entire wing of the station now. Expanded from the small embassy conference room where Marcus had first shown them his impossible theory. The halls were full of students, Valir learning to read without their genetic memory, Kesh discovering their ancestors' true history, Sarathi confronting millennia of misunderstood texts, and humans teaching them all. Humans who carried no inherited linguistic baggage, whose minds were flexible enough to learn any language, even dead ones. Marcus found her in her office, staring at a star chart on her display. Thinking about the next expedition? He asked. Always, she said, then smiled. Did you finish with the Zorathi delegation? Just now. 3 of them cried when they realized their creation myths were actually rescue stories. Turns out most of the ancient species in the Concordance are descendants of first-teacher refugee programs. He sat down heavily. Every species we've studied so far has the same pattern. The first teachers found them after some disaster, gave them language tools to rebuild, and then disappeared, leaving only the archives to explain what happened. They were dying, Sarah said. The genetic plague. They knew it was only a matter of time, so they spent their last years creating these teaching archives, making sure knowledge wouldn't die with them. 80,000 years, Marcus said wonderingly. They've been waiting 80,000 years for someone to read them. There was a knock on the door. Sarah looked up to see Thelvan standing in the doorway, looking oddly hesitant. In the year since they'd visited the Valir archives, he'd changed. His crystalline features seemed softer, less rigid, or perhaps Sarah had just learned to read him better. Ambassador, he said, do you have a moment? Of course. Come in. He entered, moving with the careful grace of his species. I wanted to thank you before the ceremony, for your patience with me, especially at the beginning. You mean when you mocked us? Sarah asked, but there was no heat in it. Yes. When I was an arrogant fool. Thelvan's crest arranged itself in a pattern Sarah had learned meant self-deprecating humor. I've been thinking about that day. What I said to my aide in High Valir, thinking you couldn't understand. Dust pretending to be mountains, Sarah recalled. Yes, I meant it as an insult. But now, he paused, searching for words. Now I think perhaps dust is more important than mountains. Mountains stand still. Dust travels. It spreads. It carries seeds and nutrients. It changes the world it touches. That's very poetic, Sarah said, surprised. I've been reading human literature, Thelvan admitted, part of my studies at the Institute. Your species writes beautifully about impermanence, about change and loss and adaptation. The Valir have spent 40,000 years trying to be unchanging mountains. You've spent your entire existence as dust, scattering and reforming and learning new shapes. I think I understand now why the first teachers chose to preserve their knowledge in a way that only dust could read. He pulled out a tablet and handed it to Sarah. I wanted to show you something before I present it at the ceremony. It's a paper I'm publishing in the Valor Academic Journal. The title is Learning from Linguistic Infants, a re-examination of genetic memory as impediment rather than advantage. Sarah skimmed the abstract. It was radical, almost heretical by Valor standards. It argued that genetic memory, while useful for cultural preservation, prevented the cognitive flexibility necessary for true learning. It suggested that the Valor and other species should develop new educational methods that deliberately worked against their inherited knowledge. Telvan, she said slowly, this is going to cause controversy. I know. Several of my colleagues have already disowned me. He arranged his crest in a pattern of contentment. It's remarkably freeing. For 40,000 years, my species has valued agreement and continuity above all else. I'm discovering that disagreement and change can be valuable too. Human values, not just human, Sarah corrected. First teacher values. They knew that rigid thinking would kill them, so they built flexibility into their archives. You're not adopting human values. You're recovering the values your ancestors were trying to pass down. Perhaps that's the same thing, Delvan suggested. Perhaps the first teachers would have liked humans very much. The ceremony that afternoon was different from the solemn vote of the morning. This was a celebration, with representatives from dozens of species gathered in the Institute's main hall. Food from 100 worlds, music that ranged from Valor crystal harmonics to earth jazz. Sarah stood on the stage looking out at the crowd. A year ago, this would have been unimaginable. Humans teaching aliens, aliens learning from humans, everyone united by the knowledge that their languages were gifts from the dead. She began her speech in ghost script, the ancient words rolling off her tongue with practiced ease. Then she translated. The first teachers wrote that to preserve knowledge is to preserve life. Today we preserve both. Today we remember. The crowd responded in a dozen languages, all carrying the same meaning. We remember. After the formal presentations, Sarah found herself at a quiet table with her original team. Marcus, Kenji, Yuki, the four of them who'd started this impossible journey in a moment of humiliated desperation. To dust pretending to be mountains, Marcus said, raising his glass. They all drank to that. I've been analyzing the deep space surveys, Kenji said after a moment. The ones looking for more ghost script sites. And? Sarah asked, we're finding more. Dozens more. And they're not random. They're arranged in a pattern like they're pointing toward something. Pointing where? Yuki asked. Kenji pulled up a star map on his tablet. Red dots marked known ghost script sites. Lines connected them, forming vectors that all converged on a single point deep in uncharted space. Here, he said. The predecessor home system, maybe, or something more important. The sites closer to this location have more complex text, more detailed, like they're building up to something. Sarah studied the map. The convergence point was months of travel away, in a region of space no one had ever explored. We need to go there, Marcus said. Obviously, Sarah agreed. But we'll need support. Ships, supplies, a proper expedition. The council will approve it, Delvan said, appearing at their table. I've already drafted the proposal. The keepers of the archives can request whatever they need. You want to come? Sarah asked. Someone needs to document the humans making more impossible discoveries, Delvan said. His crest was arranged in the pattern Sarah had learned meant genuine happiness. Besides, I find I've developed a taste for linguistic adventure. 40,000 years of certainty was making me dull. Sarah looked at her team, at the alien who'd become their unlikely friend, at the map showing paths to mysteries 80,000 years old. Then we'll go, she said. We'll follow the first teacher's trail to whatever they wanted us to find. We'll be the students they hoped for. That night, Sarah stood at the observation deck watching stars wheel past the station. Somewhere out there, the first teachers had lived and died, leaving behind only words and hopes. They'd built their archives for someone eventually to find. They couldn't have known it would be humans. Young, fractured, flexible humans with no genetic memory and too much curiosity. Humans who learned languages the hard way, from scratch every single generation. Maybe that was the point. Maybe the first teachers had known that anyone with inherited knowledge would never be able to break free of it. Maybe they'd been waiting specifically for a species like humanity, one that had to learn everything and therefore could learn anything. Sarah pulled out her tablet and opened her personal journal. She wrote a single line in ghost script, words she was still learning but understood in her bones. We are not the destination. We are the journey continuing. Behind her, the Institute hummed with activity. Aliens learning from humans.